In a peaceful suburban neighborhood, where the streets were lined with neatly trimmed hedges and children played freely under the watchful eyes of their parents, lived Marcus Johnson. At 42 years old, Marcus was a man who seemed to blend into the background of everyday life. He spent his days tending to his garden, nurturing plants as if they were his own children, and mentoring local kids at the community center. His wheelchair never stopped him from living a full life. Instead, it became just another part of who he was, a symbol of resilience rather than limitation. To those around him, Marcus appeared to be an ordinary man trying to make the best of his circumstances. What no one knew, however, was that beneath his calm exterior lay a past so extraordinary it could fill books. Once upon a time, Marcus wasn't known by his real name, but by a code name whispered in awe and fear: Ghost. As an elite Delta Force commander, he had been deployed on some of the most dangerous missions across the globe. His skills were unmatched. He moved like a shadow, striking swiftly and disappearing without a trace. But after a catastrophic mission left him paralyzed, Marcus decided to leave that violent chapter of his life behind. He chose this quiet neighborhood precisely because it offered him anonymity. Here, he could live without the weight of his former identity pressing down on him. The scars on his body and soul remained hidden, buried under layers of determination to start anew. Marcus found purpose in helping others, teaching kids discipline through sports and sharing stories about perseverance. To them, he was simply Mr. Marcus, the kind man in the wheelchair who always had a smile and wise advice. But even in this idyllic setting, trouble has a way of finding people when least expected. On a crisp autumn evening, as golden leaves swirled in the breeze, two rookie police officers patrolled the area. Officers Daniels and Ramirez were fresh out of the academy, eager to prove themselves but inexperienced in reading situations carefully. They received a vague tip about a suspect fleeing from a nearby robbery, a black male, mid-40s, wearing dark clothing. Without much detail to go on, they scanned the streets, their eyes landing on Marcus sitting quietly on his porch. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the neighborhood. Marcus wore a hoodie against the chill, its hood pulled up casually. To the untrained eye, he might have matched the vague description given earlier. But what the officers failed to notice were the glaring differences. The suspect was reported to be taller, thinner, and wearing a red jacket. None of these details mattered to Daniels and Ramirez, though. All they saw was a potential lead. As they approached Marcus's house, their flashlights cutting through the growing darkness, tension began to build. Marcus looked up calmly, sensing their presence before they even spoke. When the officers demanded he stand up, his response was measured and polite. "I can't," he said simply, gesturing to his wheelchair. Instead of listening or asking further questions, the officers grew suspicious. Their tone hardened, and within minutes, Marcus found himself being handcuffed, his protests falling on deaf ears. Neighbors peeked out of their windows, shocked and confused. How could this gentleman, who had become such a beloved figure in the community, be treated like a criminal? For Marcus, the indignity of the moment stung deeply. Yet, as he sat in the back of the squad car, his expression remained unreadable. Inside, however, something stirred, a flicker of the warrior he once was, lying dormant but far from forgotten. Little did anyone know, this wrongful arrest would set off a chain of events that would change everything. For Marcus, for the officers, and for the entire neighborhood. The squad car ride was silent, save for the occasional crackle of the police radio. Marcus sat in the back seat, his hands cuffed behind him, staring out the window as familiar streets blurred past. His mind raced, though his face betrayed nothing. He replayed the events leading up to this moment, the abrupt arrival of the officers, their dismissive tone, and the way they ignored his explanations. It wasn't just frustration that bubbled inside him. It was disbelief. After all he'd done to build a quiet, honest life, how could this happen? When they arrived at the precinct, Marcus was led inside with little ceremony. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the worn walls. Officers moved about, some glancing curiously at the man in the wheelchair, but quickly losing interest. To them, he was just another suspect, another statistic. But Marcus noticed everything. The layout of the room, the positioning of desks, the exits, and even the subtle dynamics between the officers. Years of training had ingrained in him an almost instinctual awareness of his surroundings. He was taken to an interrogation room, a small, sterile space with a single table and 2 chairs bolted to the floor. One officer stayed outside while the other, Detective Harris, entered and began questioning him. Harris was older, with graying hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. He started by asking basic questions: name, address, occupation. Marcus answered calmly, providing clear and concise responses. When asked about his whereabouts earlier that evening, Marcus explained that he had been at home, alone, watching television. He even mentioned the security cameras mounted outside his house, which recorded every movement around his property. But Harris didn't seem interested in verifying Marcus's alibi. Instead, he pressed harder, accusing Marcus of lying and demanding answers about the robbery. "We know you're involved," Harris said, leaning forward aggressively. "You think we don't see through you." Marcus felt a surge of anger, but kept it tightly controlled. He repeated his story patiently, offering to show them the footage from his cameras. Yet each time he tried to explain, Harris interrupted or dismissed him. The detective's tone grew more hostile, his words laced with thinly veiled contempt. At one point, he muttered under his breath, "Figure someone like you would try to play innocent." The comment stung, not because it was unexpected, but because it hit too close to truths Marcus had spent years trying to escape. Someone like him, a black man in a wheelchair, presumed guilty before proven otherwise. For a fleeting moment, Marcus considered letting his frustration show, raising his voice, or demanding better treatment. But he knew better. Losing control wouldn't help. It would only reinforce their biases. Hours passed, and the interrogation continued in circles. Marcus's calm demeanor began to unnerve Harris, who clearly expected him to crack under pressure. But Marcus had faced far worse than this. In his Delta Force days, he'd endured interrogations by enemies who sought to break him physically and mentally. Compared to that, this was child's play. Still, the injustice of the situation gnawed at him. He thought about the community he'd worked so hard to serve, the kids he mentored, the neighbors who trusted him, and wondered how they'd react when they heard what had happened. As the night wore on, fatigue crept in, but Marcus refused to let it show. He studied Harris closely, noting the signs of impatience and doubt in the detective's body language. He also observed the younger officer stationed outside the door, whose shifting gaze suggested discomfort with the situation. There were cracks in their confidence, however slight, and Marcus filed these observations away for later use. By the time they finally processed him and locked him in a holding cell, exhaustion weighed heavily on Marcus. But beneath the surface, something else stirred, a flicker of the resolve that had once made him one of the most formidable soldiers in the world. As he sat there, surrounded by cold metal bars, Marcus realized something important. This wasn't just about clearing his name anymore. This was about exposing the flaws in a system that allowed such mistakes to happen. And if the authorities weren't willing to listen, then perhaps it was time to remind them exactly who they were dealing with. The holding cell was cold and dimly lit, the kind of place designed to make people feel small and insignificant. Marcus sat in his wheelchair, his posture relaxed, but his mind sharp as a blade. The hours ticked by slowly, marked only by the faint hum of fluorescent lights above and the occasional echo of footsteps in the hallway outside. To anyone watching, he might have seemed defeated, a man resigned to his fate. But inside, Marcus's thoughts churned like a storm. He replayed the events of the night over and over again, dissecting every detail. The officers' dismissive attitudes, their refusal to listen, the way they had treated him not as a human being, but as a stereotype, all of it gnawed at him. It wasn't just about this one wrongful arrest. It was about everything it represented. Marcus had seen injustice before, both in his military career and in the years since, but this felt personal. This time, it was happening to him. As dawn approached, the precinct began to stir with activity. Shift changes brought new faces into the station, some curious about the wheelchair suspect locked up overnight. A young officer named Rodriguez stopped by Marcus's cell, glancing at him with a mix of pity and unease. "You okay in there?" he asked hesitantly, as if unsure whether Marcus would lash out. Marcus gave him a measured nod. "I'm fine," he said calmly, his voice steady and devoid of anger. "But I'd appreciate it if someone checked the security footage from my house. It'll clear this whole thing up." Rodriguez looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. I'll see what I can do," he muttered before walking away. Marcus watched him go, noting the hesitation in his step. There was something there, doubt, maybe even guilt. People often underestimated Marcus because of his quiet demeanor, but he had always been good at reading others. He filed the interaction away, tucking it into the growing list of observations forming in his mind. Back in the interrogation room earlier, Detective Harris had tried to break in with accusations and insults, but Marcus hadn't budged. Now, alone in the cell, he allowed himself to reflect on those moments. Each word Harris had thrown at him, the subtle jabs, the condescending tone, had been meant to provoke a reaction. But Marcus knew better than to give them the satisfaction. Instead, he used the time to think, to plan, to prepare. His thoughts drifted back to his days in Delta Force. He remembered the grueling training exercises, the missions that tested not just physical strength but mental fortitude. They had taught him how to adapt, how to turn any situation to his advantage. Even now, sitting in a cramped cell with no obvious means of escape, Marcus could feel those lessons coming back to him. His body might be confined to a wheelchair, but his mind was as agile as ever. By morning, a strange clarity settled over him. He realized he couldn't rely on the system to fix itself, not when it was so deeply flawed. If he wanted justice, he would have to take matters into his own hands. The idea both frightened and excited him. For years, he had worked hard to leave his violent past behind, to build a life rooted in peace and service. But this was different. This wasn't about revenge or violence. It was about exposing the truth and holding people accountable. As sunlight filtered through the narrow windows of the precinct, Marcus made a decision. He wouldn't let this end here. He would use every skill he possessed, every tactic, every strategy, to prove his innocence and shine a light on the systemic failures that had landed him in this cell. And if that meant reminding the world who he really was, then so be it. For the first time since his arrest, a faint smile crossed Marcus's face, not because he enjoyed the thought of conflict, but because he finally had a purpose again. The quiet man in the wheelchair was gone. In his place stood someone far more dangerous, a man who had nothing left to lose. As the morning light filled the precinct, Marcus began to put his plan into motion. Years of discipline and precision had taught him that success depended not on brute force, but on careful observation and calculated moves. Sitting in his cell, he appeared calm and unassuming, but his mind was a whirlwind of strategy. Every detail mattered. The timing of guard rotations, the location of security cameras, the habits of the officers who passed by his cell. To anyone else, these might seem like trivial things, but to Marcus, they were pieces of a puzzle waiting to be solved. His first opportunity came during breakfast delivery. The young corrections officer wheeled a cart down the hallway, stopping at each cell to hand out trays of food. When the officer reached Marcus's cell, he slid the tray through the slot in the bars without making eye contact. But Marcus noticed something important. The officer carried a pen clipped to his shirt pocket. It was a small thing, seemingly insignificant, but Marcus knew its potential value. "Excuse me," Marcus said politely, his voice warm and friendly. The officer paused, looking at him with mild curiosity. "Could you do me a favor? My hands are cuffed, and I can't reach the tray." "Would you mind placing it on my lap?" The officer hesitated for a moment before nodding. He opened the cell door just wide enough to step inside, keeping his body angled defensively. As he leaned forward to place the tray on Marcus's lap, Marcus acted quickly but subtly. With practiced ease, he used his fingers to pluck the pen from the officer's pocket. The movement was so smooth, so natural, that the officer didn't even notice. By the time the door clicked shut again, Marcus had what he needed, a tool that could become a key. Back in his cell, Marcus examined the pen carefully. It wasn't much, but it would serve its purpose. Using techniques he'd learned during survival training, he began working on the handcuffs still secured around his wrists. His movements were deliberate, patient, and nearly silent. Hours passed as he twisted and turned the pen, applying pressure at precise angles until finally, with a soft click, the cuffs sprang open. Freedom for his hands was the first step, but Marcus knew there was still a long way to go. Next, he focused on gaining the trust of another officer, someone whose demeanor suggested they weren't entirely comfortable with the situation. Officer Rodriguez, the same young man who had checked on him earlier, became his target. Over the next few hours, Marcus engaged him in conversation whenever he passed by the cell. He spoke about his work mentoring kids, shared stories about his garden, and even joked lightly about how boring it was to sit in a cell all day. Slowly but surely, Rodriguez began to see Marcus not as a suspect, but as a person. "You don't seem like a bad guy," Rodriguez admitted one afternoon, lingering near the cell longer than usual. "I hope they figure this out soon." "They will," Marcus replied with a faint smile. "But sometimes, people need a little push to see the truth." That night, Marcus feigned illness, clutching his stomach and groaning softly to draw attention. When Rodriguez arrived to check on him, Marcus pleaded for help, claiming he felt dizzy and needed water. Reluctantly, the officer unlocked the cell door and stepped inside. In an instant, Marcus moved, not violently, but with the efficiency of someone who had spent years mastering control. He disarmed Rodriguez swiftly, using leverage and pressure points to incapacitate him without causing serious harm. Within seconds, the officer lay unconscious on the floor, and Marcus had access to his keys and radio. With newfound freedom, Marcus slipped out of the cell and into the shadows of the precinct. Moving silently, he navigated the corridors, avoiding cameras and staying out of sight. Each step brought him closer to his goal, exposing the truth and clearing his name. But more than that, it brought him closer to reclaiming the sense of justice he had fought for his entire life. For Marcus, this wasn't just an escape, it was the beginning of something bigger. Once free from his cell, Marcus moved through the precinct with the precision of a predator stalking its prey. Every step was deliberate, every breath controlled. He had spent years mastering the art of invisibility during his time in Delta Force, and now those skills came rushing back to him like muscle memory. The fluorescent lights overhead cast long shadows, but Marcus knew how to use them to his advantage. He stuck to the edges of hallways, avoiding direct lines of sight, and timed his movements between the rhythmic patrols of officers. His first objective was the security room, a small, unassuming space tucked away near the rear of the building. It was the nerve center of the precinct, housing monitors that displayed live footage from cameras throughout the station. If Marcus could access it, he could erase evidence of his escape, while planting false leads to throw off pursuit. More importantly, he could retrieve the security tapes from his neighborhood, proof of his innocence that the detectives had ignored. Reaching the door, Marcus paused, listening for any signs of movement inside. When he heard nothing, he used the keys taken from Officer Rodriguez to unlock it. The room was dimly lit, dominated by rows of screens showing various angles of the precinct. A single guard sat slumped in a chair, scrolling through his phone with earbuds in place. Marcus approached silently, his wheelchair gliding across the floor without a sound. Before the guard could react, Marcus tapped him firmly on the shoulder and applied pressure to a specific point on his neck. The man went limp instantly, unconscious but unharmed. With the guard out of commission, Marcus turned his attention to the monitors. His fingers flew over the keyboard as he accessed the system, navigating through files with ease. Years of working with advanced technology in the military made this task second nature. He located the footage from his arrest and deleted it, replacing it with looped clips that showed an empty holding cell. Then, he uploaded the security tapes from his home onto a USB drive, ensuring he had undeniable proof of his alibi. As a final touch, he inserted fake alerts into the system, notifications suggesting there had been a breach in another part of the building. This would divert attention away from him and buy him precious time. Satisfied with his work, Marcus exited the security room and headed toward the supply closet nearby. Inside, he found what he needed: duct tape, zip ties, and a spare uniform jacket. He secured the guard in the corner, binding his hands and feet and gagging him lightly to prevent him from raising the alarm too soon. Marcus then donned the jacket, pulling up the hood to obscure his face. Disguised as just another officer, he pushed himself through the corridors, blending seamlessly into the chaos caused by the false alerts he triggered. As he neared the exit, Marcus encountered two officers rushing past, their radios crackling with updates about the supposed breach. They barely glanced at him, assuming he was part of the response team. With a calm nod, he continued onward, his heart steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Outside, the cool night air hit him like a wave. For a moment, Marcus allowed himself to breathe deeply, savoring the taste of freedom. But he knew this was only the beginning. Escaping the precinct was one thing. Exposing the truth and holding those responsible accountable was another. As he disappeared into the darkness, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't running away. He was moving forward, ready to fight not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been wronged by a broken system. The game had changed, and Marcus Johnson, once known as Ghost, was no longer playing defense. Once outside the precinct, Marcus didn't waste a second. He knew the clock was ticking. His escape would be discovered soon enough. And when it was, the entire police force would be on high alert. But Marcus had no intention of hiding in the shadows. Instead, he moved with purpose, heading straight for an old contact from his Delta Force days. There was someone who owed him a favor, someone who could provide him with the resources he needed to take this fight to the next level. The contact's name was Elena Cruz, a former intelligence analyst turned private investigator. She lived in a modest apartment on the outskirts of the city, far from prying eyes. When Marcus arrived at her door late that night, she didn't look surprised to see him. Elena had always been sharp, able to read between the lines better than most people. "I heard about your little run-in with the cops," she said dryly, stepping aside to let him in. "Figured you'd show up sooner or later." Inside, Marcus explained everything: the wrongful arrest, the corruption within the department, and his plan to expose it all. Elena listened intently, nodding occasionally as she processed the information. By the time he finished, she was already pulling out files and booting up her computer. "You're going to need more than just security footage if you want to take down an entire system," she warned him. "But I think I can help with that." Over the next few hours, Elena worked tirelessly, tapping into networks and databases that most people didn't even know existed. She uncovered internal memos, disciplinary records, and whistleblower testimonies, all pointing to systemic misconduct within the precinct. Some officers had been flagged repeatedly for excessive use of force. Others were suspected of tampering with evidence. Together, these documents painted a damning picture of a department riddled with flaws. While Elena gathered intel, Marcus reached out to another group of allies, members of marginalized communities who had faced similar injustices. Word spread quickly among them, thanks to social media and underground networks. People began sharing their stories of wrongful arrests, racial profiling, and abuse of power. Many were hesitant at first, afraid of retaliation, but Marcus reassured them. "This isn't just about me," he told them. "It's about making sure no one else has to go through what we've gone through." By morning, Marcus had assembled a small but determined team. They set up a makeshift headquarters in an abandoned warehouse, using laptops, burner phones, and whatever equipment they could scrounge together. Elena coordinated logistics while Marcus strategized, mapping out every step of their campaign. The goal was clear: gather irrefutable evidence, expose the truth, and demand accountability. As news of Marcus's escape spread, public opinion began to shift. Local journalists picked up the story, highlighting the inconsistencies in the police report and questioning why an innocent man had been treated so harshly. Protesters took to the streets, holding signs that read "Justice for Marcus Johnson" and "No more wrongful arrests." Even some officers within the department started speaking out anonymously, admitting that the system was broken and needed reform. Meanwhile, Marcus stayed one step ahead of the authorities. Using encrypted messages and dead drops, he communicated with his growing network without revealing his location. He also leaked select pieces of evidence to trusted reporters, ensuring the story stayed in the headlines. Each revelation added fuel to the fire, turning what had started as a personal vendetta into a full-blown movement. For Marcus, this wasn't just about clearing his name anymore. It was about something bigger, a chance to shine a light on the cracks in the system and push for real change. And as he watched the momentum build, he realized something important. He wasn't alone in this fight. For the first time in years, he felt hope, not just for himself, but for everyone counting on him to make things right. The climax of Marcus's mission came on a rainy Tuesday evening, when the city was already buzzing with tension. News outlets had been running non-stop coverage of his escape and the growing scandal surrounding the police department. Protesters filled the streets, demanding answers, while internal investigations were launched to address the mounting allegations of misconduct. But Marcus knew that exposing the truth required more than leaks and public pressure. It needed a decisive blow. He chose the precinct itself as the stage for his final act. Under cover of darkness, Marcus infiltrated the building once again, this time with precision honed by days of planning. Dressed in plain clothes and using a stolen ID badge, he blended seamlessly into the late-night staff. The guards at the entrance barely glanced at him as he wheeled past, clutching a duffel bag filled with tools and devices provided by Elena. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Officers whispered nervously about the ghost who had slipped through their fingers twice now. Marcus's target was the secure server room, a heavily guarded area where all digital records were stored. Getting there undetected would be risky, but Marcus had anticipated every obstacle. Using blueprints Elena had obtained, he navigated the labyrinthine corridors, avoiding cameras and staying out of sight. When he reached the door to the server room, he encountered two armed officers stationed outside. Rather than engaging them directly, Marcus relied on psychology, a tactic he'd mastered during his Delta Force days. He rolled up to them casually, pretending to be lost. "Hey, I'm new here," he said with a sheepish smile. "They sent me to check some backups, but I can't find the right room. Could you point me in the direction of its support?" The officers exchanged skeptical glances, but eventually pointed him down the hall. As soon as they turned their backs, Marcus doubled back, slipping into the server room unnoticed. Once inside, he worked quickly, connecting his laptop to the mainframe. His hands moved deftly over the keyboard, bypassing firewalls and encryption protocols with ease. Within minutes, he had copied terabytes of data, incriminating emails, falsified reports, and evidence of systemic corruption spanning years. But Marcus didn't stop there. Knowing the department would try to discredit him, he planted a failsafe, an encrypted file containing all the evidence, set to release automatically to multiple news outlets if anything happened to him. It was insurance, ensuring the truth would come out no matter what. As alarms began blaring throughout the building, Marcus made his exit. SWAT teams swarmed the precinct, their flashlights cutting through the shadows as they searched for the intruder. Cornered on the rooftop, Marcus stood tall, or as tall as his seated position allowed, facing them with unwavering resolve. Behind him loomed the city skyline, its lights reflecting off the rain-soaked pavement below. "Stand down," one officer shouted, weapon trained on him. But Marcus remained calm, raising his voice so everyone could hear. "You picked the wrong man to mess with," he declared, his tone steady and commanding. "This isn't just about me. It's about every person you've wronged, every life you've ruined because of your arrogance and prejudice." With that, he held up a remote control, pressing a button that broadcast the evidence live to every major news station in the city. Screens lit up across town, displaying irrefutable proof of the department's wrongdoing. Gasps rippled through the crowd gathered outside the precinct as the truth unfolded before their eyes. For a moment, silence reigned. Then, cheers erupted from the streets below, echoing into the night. Marcus lowered the remote, meeting the stunned gazes of the officers surrounding him. "Your system is broken," he said simply. "Fix it or face the consequences." And with that, Marcus disappeared into the storm, leaving behind not just chaos, but the seeds of change. In the days that followed, the city was ablaze with outrage and demands for accountability. The evidence Marcus had exposed painted a damning picture of corruption within the police department. Internal Affairs launched an immediate investigation, and public pressure forced city officials to act swiftly. Officers implicated in misconduct were suspended pending review, while others, like Daniels and Ramirez, who had wrongfully arrested Marcus, were fired outright. Detective Harris faced criminal charges for abuse of power, his career crumbling under the weight of his actions. For Marcus, however, there was no victory lap. He vanished as quietly as he had reemerged, leaving behind only whispers of his presence. Some speculated that he had left town entirely. Others believed he was still out there, watching from the shadows. What everyone agreed on, though, was this: Marcus Johnson, or Ghost, as some now called him, had ignited a movement. His actions became a rallying cry for justice, inspiring protests, policy changes, and community initiatives aimed at reforming law enforcement practices. Back in the neighborhood where it all began, life slowly returned to normal, but not without lasting impact. Neighbors spoke about Marcus with newfound admiration, recalling how they'd underestimated the quiet man in the wheelchair. Kids at the community center asked if Mr. Marcus would ever come back to teach them basketball again. Even those who hadn't known him personally felt the ripple effects of his courage, finding strength in their own struggles against injustice. Marcus himself resurfaced months later, not publicly, but among trusted allies like Elena and members of the grassroots network he'd helped build. He adopted a new identity, living discreetly while continuing to work behind the scenes. Though he no longer sought the spotlight, his influence remained undeniable. Through encrypted messages and anonymous tips, he guided others fighting similar battles, sharing strategies and resources to amplify their efforts. One evening, as rain drizzled over the city, Marcus sat on a park bench overlooking the community center. A group of children played basketball nearby, laughing and cheering as they practiced dribbling drills. Watching them, Marcus allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. He thought about the choices that had brought him here, the sacrifices, the risks, the scars both visible and invisible. It wasn't easy, walking away from violence only to be pulled back into conflict. But deep down, he knew he'd done the right thing. As he prepared to leave, one of the kids noticed him sitting there. "Hey, mister," the boy called out, jogging over. "Do you know how to play ball?" Marcus smiled faintly, nodding. "A little," he replied. "Can you show me?" the boy asked eagerly. For a moment, Marcus hesitated. Then, with a quiet chuckle, he wheeled closer to the court. As he demonstrated the simple crossover move, the boy's eyes lit up with excitement. Other kids gathered around, clamoring for tips and stories. For the first time in weeks, Marcus felt a sense of peace, not because he'd solved every problem or fixed every flaw in the system, but because he planted seeds of hope. That night, as he rolled home through empty streets, Marcus reminded himself why he'd chosen this path. Change didn't happen overnight, and it certainly didn't come without sacrifice. But every small step mattered. Every voice raised, every truth uncovered, every life touched. It all added up to something greater than any one person could achieve alone. And so Marcus disappeared once more into the fabric of the city, a ghost in plain sight. To the world, he was just another face in the crowd. But to those who truly understood, he was proof that even in the darkest moments, light could break through. And sometimes, it came from the most unexpected places.